Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Digging Deeper moment number 257. The purpose of our Digging Deeper moments is to take God's Word to God's world, and we're so glad that you've joined us. In our current series, How to Understand the Bible, we've been using Genesis 6, 1 through 4 to illustrate how 5 things can help us understand the Bible better, something that's called hermeneutics. It really comes down to a text content, context, communication style, comparison text from the rest of the Bible, and Christ. That is, how did Jesus interpret these texts? We've been looking at Genesis 6 through 1, which states, "Now it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not strive with man forever, for he is indeed flesh, and yet his days shall be 120 years. There were giants on the earth in those days, and also afterwards, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men of old, men of renown." Last week we looked at the content. That is, what is these 4 verses talking about? And we saw there's no direct support for any of the 5 ways that this text is interpreted. There's no direct reference to it being an ancient myth, to fallen angels that cohabitated with women, to mighty kings of old, or to the intermarrying of the line of Seth and the line of Cain, or demons inhabiting people. The text merely mentions a time in that the human race began to multiply, married prolifically, that had female offspring, that there was something called Nephilim, giants in the earth at the time, and also men of renown. So we can't really say that any of these interpretations have found support by the content. Tonight we're going to look at the context and see what it reveals, or if it reveals anything about what these verses are saying. Now, Genesis 4, which gives the genealogy of Cain, and Genesis 5, which gives the genealogy of Seth, precede Genesis chapter 6, 1 through 4. And Genesis chapter 6, 5 through chapter 9 follows with the story of Noah. So it's tucked in between 2 genealogies, which precede it, and the story of the Noah's flood, which follows it. Well, we go back in Genesis chapter 3. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, this is the story when Adam and Eve sinned against God in the Garden of Eden, and God had to speak judgment to the man and the woman as well as the serpent who tempted him. God says to the serpent in verse 15, "And I will put enmity between you, the serpent," that's the devil, "and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." Now after this, the man and the woman were kicked out of the Garden of Eden in chapter 3, verses 20 through 24. And then following this, we come upon the story of Cain and Abel in Genesis chapter 4 and Cain's genealogies. Now what we see is both sons are the seed of Eve. So remember, in chapter 3, God said there would be enmity between the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman. And what we see now following this is basically a story about Cain and Abel, who are both the seed of the woman. But what we find is that we find hostility between Cain and Abel, which is the fleshing out of the hostility between the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman. So Cain, by his actions in chapter 4, verses 1 through 16, reveals he's the seed of Satan. Why? Because he kills his brother. Why does he kill his brother? Now I'm using another text in order to explain this text, and we'll get to that more later in our series, but I want you to see how the Bible does explain what's happening before in the context. For this is the message that you heard from the beginning, that we should love one another, not as Cain, who was of the wicked one and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his works were evil and his brothers were righteous. So what we're seeing here is we're seeing a conflict early in the Bible, immediately after God's judgment of the serpent, saying the seed of the woman will be hostile and the seed to the seed of the serpent, and the seed of the serpent will be hostile to the seed of the woman. I think this is explaining what the Bible is really saying. Now this story in chapter 4, verses 1 through 16, are followed by the lineage of Cain down to the 7th generation. And you can read that for yourself in the Bible. So now we see, as we continue in chapter 4, that chapter 4 concludes the way it began with a statement by Eve. Genesis 4:1 begins with, "Now Adam knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, and said, I've acquired a man from the Lord." Then it goes on to say how she got another son who was Abel, and then of course we have the story of Cain killing Abel, and then Cain's genealogy. But the chapter ends in verse 25 when it says, "And Adam knew his wife again." This is after Cain killed Abel. "And she bore a son named Seth, for God has appointed another seed for me instead of Abel, whom Cain killed." Notice that she mentions seed. So there's a theme here. Now, the word Seth in the Bible means foundation or appointed. So what we see is that Seth takes the place of Abel as the head of the lineage or genealogical line because he's appointed, which literally means he was placed. Elohim, she says, that's the name for God, has placed another seed instead of Abel. How has he placed him? As the head of the genealogy, which we're going to see in chapter 5. Then it goes on to say in verse 26, and as for Seth, to him also a son was born, and he named him Enosh, and then men began to call upon the name of the Lord. Now the Hebrew of this verse is a little obscure. The second sentence isn't really a new sentence. It's all one sentence, and it goes like this. And Seth also had a son, and named him Enosh. At that time he, not men, it's singular in the Hebrew, began to call upon the name of the Lord. And this is why the word men is italicized in most Bibles. It's not there because it's singular. This could be telling us that when Enosh was born, Seth began calling upon the name of the Lord, or it could be telling us that Enosh began calling on the name of the Lord. Regardless, there is a contrast that's presented in Genesis 4 between the seed of the serpent, Cain, and that of Abel. And now at the end of the chapter, there is a contrast being presented between the seed of the serpent and the seed of Eve, which is Seth, and they call upon the name of the Lord. This is the overall context of Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, at least what comes before it. And remember, there are 5 different views of how to take our text that we're studying. It's a myth. It's about fallen angels. It's mighty kings of old. It's the intermarrying of the line of Seth with the line of Cain, or it's demons inhabiting people. And as we saw last week, the content of these verses isn't definitive. It doesn't give us any information really that proves one interpretation over another. But Genesis 4, which precedes our text of Genesis 6, 1 through 4, does point towards the intermarrying of the line of Seth with the line of Cain. And so we have to give that kind of a check minus. And next week we're going to look at chapter 5 and that genealogy to see if the context continues to point towards this method of interpretation. We're out of time, so if this lesson's helped you, please like us on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, subscribe to our YouTube channel, or check out our live podcast on either Apple or Spotify. And hey, be sure to share this lesson with a friend, and I hope to see you next week.